Welcome to the War on Consciousness. Thank you for joining us for this first episode. My name is Aaron Abke, and I'm joined alongside my good friend and co-host, Brandon Bozarth. And we are very excited to bring you this brand new series that we believe is a very unique show in a couple of regards. But the main purpose of this show is going to be a twofold purpose. The first being to really look at and uncover the collective darkness and shadows within our world today. And the second purpose is then to hopefully find and discover where those distortions actually find their origin within us. Because as we know, we can truly only heal the world by first healing ourselves. And that is why the tagline for the show is, "Your freedom begins where the war within you ends." So I'm going to speak to the first point briefly, and then I'll kick it over to Brandon for the second point. But as I said, that this show will be looking deeply into our collective shadow at many various forms of corruption in our world today. But the purpose of this show is not just to red pill you, so to speak, for the entertainment value or, like an Alex Jones InfoWars type of approach. The purpose is to raise awareness, because awareness is the first step to healing, and we can't heal the shadows within us that we're not aware of. So each and every episode in this show is going to be looking at a different form of corruption in our world, and then aiming to see where that form of distortion finds itself within us. Until we heal it in here, it will continue to manifest out there. And so this is why, it doesn't matter if we try to overthrow our tyrannical governments or globalist corporations or corrupt politicians and world leaders, because another one will take their place. These manifestations we see in the world are only available or possible because each and every one of us is carrying those seeds within us. And so by becoming aware of those forms of corruption and seeing where they find their origin, we can actually use them as powerful catalysts to begin healing ourselves. And that brings us to the second point, which I'll kick it over to Brandon for.
Thanks, Aaron. So what I liken this show to is like a hall of mirrors. Every episode is like peering into a different reflection, a different angle, a different point of view, ultimately within your own consciousness. We think the outside world out there is somehow separate inherently from us. But the way that we're interpreting what's going on in our reality is what we'll point out in this show is one of the main sources of our bondage. And when we look in a mirror, and we don't recognize ourselves in it, maybe the reflection looks like something we couldn't even imagine. Like we'll talk about in this episode, globalism, human trafficking, whatever it might be. We can't imagine that on some level that's happening within the one consciousness that we are. And so we go, well, that's not part of me. That's not part of consciousness. That's not part of all that is. That's they. That's separate. And the birth of the they is born and brought into reality. So I'm really excited to question the idea of an us versus they paradigm, and to begin to redefine what power is and what true power is by unplugging really from the matrix of mind, the matrix of our own belief system. So with that understanding in mind, Aaron, to reinforce what you said previously, the goal of this show is our own inner transformation that will inevitably result in a transformation of our world, or what we see out there in the mirror.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've pulled out a quote here that I think also really encapsulates the heart of this series from a famous Arabic philosopher who wrote the book The Prophet, named Khalil Gibran, who said, "I say that even as the holy and the righteous cannot rise beyond the highest which is in each of you, so the wicked cannot fall lower than the lowest which is also in you." And I think that quote really speaks to projection beautifully, in that, we look at the saints and the sages of history and say, oh, they're on such a higher plane than me. And we sort of disown our light and project it onto them because we can't see it in ourselves. In the same exact way, we disown the darkness within us, and what we deny in ourselves, we deny in the world. We're not able to see it. Just like we're not able to see that the same light that's in the sage is within me. So, the show really is about empowerment and taking ownership over both the light and the darkness within us to have that inner transformation, like you said. So before we get into the topic of today's episode, which is unplugging from the matrix, I want to tackle a really important question that I think really gets to the foundation of this discussion and is really important to understand before we get into this discussion. And that is a very well-intentioned, but sort of misguided notion in the spiritual community that we often hear, where people will say, any discussion whatsoever of corruption in the world is just giving it power. So we shouldn't talk about distortions or corruption in the world because all we're doing is adding to it. And I think we really can't afford to get this idea wrong. And so I want to kick that over to you, Brandon, in terms of what do you think about this idea that any discussion of corruption is just giving it power, and what's maybe an alternative way to see this?
Yeah, it's really good. So I know you and I both talked about this many times, but as we expand our awareness, as we evolve as a collective, as a society, and as individuals, we become more aware of all that is. When you expand your awareness, what are you becoming aware of? Well, existence, more of all that is. So as you expand your awareness, you will become more aware of positivity, of joy, of the ability to simply choose to be happy for the sake of it without a need for a reason or a cause. But you will also become more aware of the darkness, more aware of the shadow within yourself, within the world. So it's actually a positive side effect of our transformation, or the transformation that's going on the planet right now. It's a side effect of, you could say, our ascension, which really just means our expansion or our evolution. So it's something that should be celebrated. Oh, wow, we're becoming more aware of everything. And like we'll talk about in this series, every situation or circumstance is fundamentally neutral, meaning we are the ones that impose meaning onto it. So yes, we're going to become more aware of the positive and negative polarity. But one reason that we're becoming aware of it is so we can look at the negative polarity and then choose to respond to it in a positive way. And that process is called transmutation, transformation, whatever you want to call it, not to turn away from it, not to avoid it, because again, what we resist persists, but what we look at disappears. So when I look at the negativity and I validate it, which doesn't mean condone it, it doesn't mean be a doormat, it means let me take this negative expression and let it sit at the table with me in my mind, in my awareness, so I can decide what it means to me, in a sense, or how I want to respond to it, or what it's bringing up in me, how it's triggering me. What kind of past and future thoughts is this bringing to my mind that's putting me in a state of fear? And how can I learn from that? What beliefs does this represent at a core level? And when I release those beliefs, who would I be on the other side of them? And so when we start to use and embrace that shadow, that negative polarity, then you'll see that it actually becomes a positive experience. And then you look at it in hindsight and go, well, was it negative at all? Or did it just lead us to more of who we are by showing us who we're not?
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about the negative polarity in detail here in a minute. But I think what you just said, Brandon, I really saw in my own life as I really started this healing journey of self-realization, in that when we start to heal things within us, it actually sharpens our awareness and discernment of where that exists outside of us. Because as A Course in Miracles says, the world that we see merely reflects our own internal frame of reference. And so in that light, like, we actually can be very thankful for the forms of darkness that are in the world, because they really become that mirror that allows us to see where that's in me. And today, for example, we're going to be sort of overviewing globalization and what that is. But where that globalization finds its seed within us is in greed. Globalization is a giant manifestation of our individual greed. And so it's like, I can't judge the Bill Gates of the world, because he simply is someone who rose to extreme levels of power. And as we're going to talk about, power polarizes negatively just by virtue of what it is. And so if I have that remnant of greed within me that's unhealed, like I would probably do very similar things with power that people like him are doing. So while it is a well-intentioned, idea that we don't want to focus on the darkness, obviously not in the sense of like complaining about it, getting angry about it. That's clearly not what we're here to do, but we do need to deeply look at it and understand where it comes from. And as I was saying in my own journey, once I started to heal myself, one of the first things I realized was that I became, almost blisteringly aware of the different forms of corruption in the world that I just wasn't privy to before. I wasn't able to see them because I was really denying my own greed. And so I was just projecting my, self-image of goodness onto everyone, saying, well, I don't think people would be that selfish. There's no way that stuff exists. I don't believe that. I can't find that within myself. But when you find it in yourself, you see it in the world immediately, because the world is just your mirror. It really is. And in that sense, we can have gratitude for it.
This quick quote, Aaron, that's really great. Bashar said once, he said, when you're transparent to yourself, any and all situations become transparent. Meaning when we're really confused with what's going on out there, we're probably on some level not being totally and completely honest with ourselves. And for most of us, it's very innocent, because it's a learned way of thinking that we have yet to question. And that's all it is. And most of us, because we haven't learned this in school, have never been given the tools to inquire and experience the power of questioning your own mind.
I think an easy way, or analogy rather, to understand what we mean when we say, these things are in the collective consciousness, is if we look at the collective consciousness as sort of a ground of soil. And that soil represents whatever energies are within us individually. Each individual person alive on planet Earth, their state of being is contributing to that collective field of consciousness. So if each and every one of us, all 8 billion of us, have little seeds of greed, then that seed of greed is in the soil, and it starts to really add up, as the accumulation increases. And so then the roots of greed can go down deeper and deeper into that soil and begin manifesting above the surface as these giant globalist monopolies that we say, wow, like how heinous and evil that people will do these things and be so corrupt. And we don't understand that they're only able to manifest because they're in our collective. And so as each one of us heals, we start eliminating those seeds from the soil, and it's just less and less capable to manifest outside of us. So let's talk a little bit about the topic of the show today, which is waking up to the matrix and unplugging from the matrix. And I think the best place to start is when we use this word, the matrix, what are we really talking about? What is the matrix?
The matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
So the matrix is the belief in the separate self. In short, the belief that I'm over here in time and space in this body, separate from you, Aaron, over there, and you are in your body. And there's space and time separating us. There was a beginning to me, which is my birth. There's an end to me, which is my death. And I am disconnected from everything in my reality. It would be akin to being a lonely wave in a vast sea of ocean. And the ocean is endless and it's massive. And there's massive waves. And I don't know what's under the surface because I'm just this tiny little wave. Well, I'd be frightened. But if I was the whole ocean, I was just focused. I was just experiencing myself only as the wave. Well, then I would feel like I have this entire ocean behind me. So the separate self will take on all of the beliefs as a finite separate self would, which means our majority, or the majority of the fear that we will have, will arise around the idea of the fear of death, survival mechanism, and we will be in our monkey mind majority of the time attempting to survive. And this is where greed comes in, because a separate self at its core, because we're all not actually separate, because that's an illusion, that experience of separation will always attempt to complete itself. It will always attempt to gain unity, which again is a paradox, because it can't gain what it already is. This is why no one has ever found unity in something out there. They've never found happiness in another person, in an experience, in a spiritual practice. It doesn't matter what it is. So the separate self will add to itself. And I love this quote: you can never get enough of what you don't actually need. So the belief that I need to add to myself to feel happy, to feel unified, which really means love. And even the Course talks about how every action is either an extension of love or a call for help, which really means I'm looking for love. And this is the core of the motivation of all of us, is to experience love. And when the separate self is not taught what we will share, the metaphysics of reality, the transformational principles of self-inquiry and self-realization and questioning our mind, then we will believe the thoughts of the ego that are designed to keep us separate, because that's how the ego survives. It goes, you have to continue seeking and looking and focusing out there, because the moment you turn inward and place your awareness on me, you will see I don't exist. You will see I'm a made-up character called your ego, called yourself, and it doesn't exist. And if that were to happen, the ego goes, well, then I would be obliterated. And that's true in a sense, but really what would happen is you would find yourself. You'd find yourself as yourself, and then realize, oh, wait a second, I'm the same self as every other self here. We are all extensions of consciousness. Everything is occurring and arising in consciousness. And that's what it's like to be outside of the matrix.
Yeah. So if the matrix is, what I see is separate from me, that's the war within ourselves we're talking about. That when that war ends, this war against reality, that the problems are out there, reality is wrong and I need to correct it. If it was only this way, I would be happy. That leads to all of these unquestioned thoughts, all these thoughts that the separate self thinks and projects outside of itself. We don't question them. And as we said, what we disown in ourselves, we disown outside of us as well. So this is how the war on consciousness happens, is that these sort of powerful elites in the world understand how human consciousness works. And they take advantage of this fact that the average person is totally unaware of their thoughts and doesn't question their thoughts. And so they can basically play each and every one of us like a pawn on their chessboard by, using fear, especially as the main weapon to control our behavior and our thinking and divide us from one another, and use all the famous strategies that the sort of negative path uses. And so that leads us to the last question here of what is the war on consciousness? In summary, for me, it's essentially suppression versus expansion. The negative polarity always seeks to suppress consciousness, and the positive polarity always seeks to expand consciousness. And these polarities dance in infinite varieties all throughout the universe in this kind of cosmic interplay of suppression, expansion, light and dark. And globalization is one of the ways we see this suppression happening, where these kind of wealthy elites come together and use their power in conjunction to manipulate the world through controlling its assets and economies and information, and then just tell us whatever they think we want to hear to feel safe and protected, and believe that these people are, helping us out, when really they're, taking advantage of our ignorance, so to speak. So when we talk about how do these forms of corruption manifest, I think it's important to understand the science of polarity. And this is where I go back to the law of one, which, most of you who know me probably know me as a law of one teacher. And the law of one just has an amazing description of these two polarities, which is describing the negative polarity as the service to self path and the positive polarity as the service to others path. And so the law of one kind of explains how each polarity of consciousness gains charge. And when we understand this, then we can really see how power corruption works. The positive polarity essentially gains charge by honoring free will and protecting it and serving it. And the negative polarity gains charge by controlling, suppressing, infringing, and manipulating free will.